Now I want to know when the user is ready to search for a particular username, and there's a couple different ways I can do that. One way I can do that is to attach a directive to the input type equals submit, and this is the ng-click directive. Just like with ng-model, I can put an expression in here. Typically, with an ng-click, you put an expression that's going to be a function call. Because what I want to happen when someone clicks on that button is I want Angular to go out and find a function that's defined on my model, so it's attached to scope, and then I want Angular to invoke it. In this case, it's a search function. And then inside of that search function, I'm going to write the code that gets the username, calls to the GitHub API, and retrieves information about that particular user. When you write expressions for ng-click, some of them can be rather fancy. You can even include things like parameters to that method call. In this case, I'm going to call search and pass in the username. That's really not necessary because scope will already have username as a property thanks to ng-model. But I'm going to leave that parameter there just so you can see how easy it is to call search and pass something along. And now before we go and implement that search, let me just clean up the user interface a little bit. I want things to be able to fit on this page, and I also want to clean up some of the things down here. Instead of having all these divs, let's just have a single div with an h2 element inside that displays the username that we retrieve. And then I'm not so much worried about location and so forth. And the image, I'm going to change that around a little bit too. Instead of displaying the avatar, which is often a large image, what I want to display is the gravatar, which by default is an 80 by 80 pixel image. It's much smaller and it'll fit on the screen a little bit nicer. And in order to do that, I need to look at the gravatar ID that comes back from the GitHub call that we're going to make. And that's going to be part of our user model. The gravatar ID is basically a hash, but then if you take that gravatar ID and you use it in a URL that points to www.gravatar.com/avatar, if I use it here, gravatar underscore ID from the user, that should be able to display that user's 80 by 80 image, and that's going to leave us more room on the page to display other information about the user. And now I can see a couple errors down here in the editor. I have a missing end div tag. I think that was right there. Now we can go and let's implement our search. Inside the controller, instead of immediately sending it off an HTTP GET request, I'm going to create a search attribute on my scope and have that equal to a function that takes a username parameter, and then I will send off the request, and I need to include that username in the request. Essentially, instead of hard coding Angular, we're going to add in username. And now let's flip over into the preview window and see how this works. Now the first thing you'll notice that there's some odd image here. And this is because we don't have the gravatar ID of a user yet, but we still have an image tag that's trying to grab an image from gravatar.com. It's just giving us a generic image back. We're going to fix that later. But right now, I just want to see if I can search and get the proper Angular information. That looks correct. If I go out and search for this, I get the right name and the right picture. So our code appears to be working. What happens if I search for something that doesn't exist? Just type in gibberish, could not fetch the user, so our error message works. Basically what happened is I sent off that HTTP request. It probably came back with a 404 saying, I don't know who this user is. That will invoke our error handler so we can display that message. What happens if I don't enter any username? Well, at that point, nothing happens. It would be nice if we could tell the user that they need to type something into that field. And one easy way to do this is to add an HTML validation attribute required. But in order for the browser to be able to tell the user that this particular input is required, I won't be able to handle ng-click on this button event. Instead, what I can handle is the ng-submit. Use that directive to catch the submit event of the form, and then have that call search, passing in the username. That will work just as well. Let's get rid of that username, which is just was displaying some debugging information. Come back to our preview window, and now we can still find Angular. If I search for nothing, I get a nice little validation message from Chrome saying I have to fill out this field, so fine. I'll fill out Rob's name, and now we can get Rob's information. So using ng-model and then either ng-submit or ng-click, we are able to take some information that a user has typed in, apply that to an API call that we make to github.com, and we can now retrieve information about different users. But let's find out some additional information about a user. It turns out that one of the pieces of information that will come back from GitHub is a URL that we can go to get all of the repositories for that user. This is an interesting exercise because if we want to display all those repositories, we're going to need some sort of loop inside of our view code to create a table row or a list element for each repository. Let's try this next.